I always get this question kind of like every year, typically more from male students, always about the veil. Because, I mean, there's always different styles, which I always kind of try to attribute it to, like, partially it's cultural difference, interpretation. It's kind of like a two-part thing. I just want to make sure I have this idea right, is that, you know, because some Muslim women don't wear head covering, and is that more just a different interpretation of modesty, or is it from some other reason? And then if it is a different interpretation of modesty, the kids always ask of like, then why are there countries that require women to wear the veil in public if it's, you know, a personal interpretation of modesty? Like, I'm trying to like help it connect in their head, because, you know, high school kids and younger kids always see things black and white. There's no
yes,
no middle ground.
Do you want to start?
It's a difficult one.
Well, it's going to be an interpretation again. Well, first, most of places where Muslims live, there is no rule of you have to wear it in public. It's very specific places. It's a very small minority. And when it comes to how you wear the hijab, it depends on where you come from and also your own style, and it's like everyone will wear the way they like it. The second part is the covering of the head. There is a general sense of modesty, and there is the specific covering of the head, where I believe that the majority, at least, believe that the majority, the interpretation is that the head is also to be covered. But I've heard of also minorities that they think that they don't need to do that. But mostly the people that I know don't cover. It's not because they believe that there is no covering, but they believe for themselves it doesn't for some reason, whatever, they're either not practicing it, or they feel that they don't need it, or whatever. People will have different reasons for that. Mm-hmm. But there is a minority that I became more and more aware of here, actually, not back when I was growing up. When I was growing up, I was not wearing it either. But here they're saying, no, it's like they're interpreting the text in a different way, so that they come up with, you don't have to actually cover your head. So the interpretation is not based only on the text, the Quranic text, but also on the practice from the time of the Prophet. So, because lots of things are how to practice, for instance, the daily prayer is not explained in the Quran. Muslims get that from the practice of the Prophet. And from the time of the Prophet, the majority agree that women did cover. And so that's my understanding of it. Maria,
so the Minority Report. So yes, I'm part of it, and I agree that certainly that is the traditional perspective, is that you cover your hair, and certainly I would say over time, as well as over geography, the majority of women do. But you have to recognize there has been a sort of a great difference also country by country. So, for example, when Islam came to India, it's not that Muslims started dressing the way people, let's say, in an Arab country would dress. You know, they kind of adapted the sari and kind of pulled it over their heads in this particular way. In Indonesia, until recently, large numbers of Muslim women didn't cover, for example. And then, of course, there are different ways of covering. I mean, even, let's say, hijab as headscarf is something that was quite different from the way women would cover, let's say, in the 19th century, 18th century, and certainly going all the way back. It was really full cover for most people. And unveiling, when the whole idea of the whole question of the veil emerged, for example, in the late 19th century in Egypt and people talked about removing the veil, they were really talking about removing the face veil, not actually removing the head. So it's changed, and but certainly, let's say in the mid 20th century, you had many, as you were saying when you were growing up as well. It might have been different.
I grew up in a secular family.
Right, there was a lot of secular. Oh, your family was secular. Yeah, I mean, there was a kind of wave of secularism that went through many parts of the Islamic world. So this is one thing that, you can do as kind of a thought experiment, or not a thought, a visual experiment. If you look at an Egyptian newspaper from the 1960s, if you get El Ahram, which is like one of the major Egyptian newspapers in the 1960s, you won't see any veiled women in the pictures in the newspaper, right? And in fact, they're all wearing sort of like nice little Jackie Kennedy type outfits, kind of whatever the trend was at that time. Kabul in Afghanistan, again, look at pictures from the 1960s, because but there was a kind of reaction, among the populations of various places. Egypt is a really clear example, but there are other places as well. Sort of not a fundamentalist movement, not something that was initiated by the state, because Egypt was during this whole time a secular state during the 70s and the 80s, but there was a very clear movement to return to sort of Islamic aspects of one's lifestyle, including dress, including hijab, that started to take place in the 1970s and the 1980s. So you have to, realize that there are differences over time. There are differences in place. There are, certainly political issues that come back and forth. In Turkey, the wearing the veil in public was banned. Right, in the by Ataturk, as well as male forms of male hats that didn't have a brim, because you're supposed to cover your head when you're a man and you pray too. You don't have to, but I mean, a lot of men will cover their head when they pray with a cap, but you can't, if it has a brim, obviously you can't pray, because your forehead has to touch the ground. And in Iran too.
Anything Western was okay, so people just took it and
turned it around, a baseball cap around. But in Iran too, right? In Iran under the Pahlavi regime, also, veiling was banned. They were forced by the state, and now there's in Iran, of course, the opposite, a kind of forced having to wear the veil. And I had this woman say to me, it was very funny when I was in Iran, and she was they had been part of a very religious community, all throughout the Pahlavi period. If they weren't allowed to go out of the house wearing a veil, and they stayed in their house, they didn't come out. So it was a very, very conservative family that I was staying with. And so anyway, she said to me, the fact that, that all women have to veil now, she goes, it makes it so hard when you want to find a good wife for your grandson, because you can't really know who the good women are and the bad women are, because they all look the same, right? So, that was kind of one particular perspective on that. But I think it's important, again, to recognize that variety, right? And yes, you can try to reinterpret versus to do it. You can say that a lot of these things have to do with context or modesty in context. So that's, my perspective. I don't say it's the majority perspective. But that I try to dress in a fashion that's modest for the context in which I live, right? So,
just wanted to.
Yeah.
I teach in high school, so I teach young Muslim women. I teach in 2 different high schools. One is an all-girls school, and hijab is not required. Then we have a boy and girls school, high school, and hijab is required on the girls. Now, that doesn't mean outside of school they have to wear it. They don't. But as part of their uniform, they do. And it's not always about interpretation. Especially here in America, a lot of times it's just about the social pressure. They feel very intimidated putting on a scarf because people will stare at them. And it doesn't matter where you fall on the interpretation line. There's an extreme peer pressure upon young teenage women, where they're at the point where it's going to be a question for them that they have to discover how they're going to answer it. And so it doesn't help then when we create an environment that makes it even more difficult for them to choose or not choose, however they look at the interpretation. Yeah.
I just wanted to note when Maria said, like, the example of Egypt. There was this secular society, and people where the more westernized you look, the more modern, the more educated you looked. The case in Algeria was different. Algeria was colonized until 1962 for 132 years. It was a very brutal colonization. And so the spiritual teachers, the religious teachers were systematically killed, tortured, harassed. So there was the teaching was very weak. Having a Quran in your home, if you were in a city, you could be killed or tortured or put in prison if you had the Quran in your house. People used to hide. Anything written in Arabic was not allowed. You were not allowed to learn anything in Arabic. So when I said that my family, especially my mother, was secular, not in the sense that they chose to be secular and westernized, but in the sense that that's what they found themselves in. After the independence, people started learning, and there was this huge coming back to learning who we are. And it's very interesting that in Algeria now, if you go to the cities, about 60 to 70% of the shops selling women's clothes are traditional clothes, not Western clothes, as opposed to other places that were not colonized. And I think this attachment to the tradition and to their identities, because they've been suppressed for so long in a very brutal way. So it's a different context, different histories.
I have a question just on how we should. Is it country by country, like for instance, the lifting of the driving ban in the kingdom, or the bathing suits? Was it in France? With, when an issue of current, I like to cover current events, and if it's related to a lot of my kids. But is it country by country, or usually?
Now.
Most Muslim women can drive around the world.
It's only Saudi Arabia.
It was only Saudi Arabia.
Right. So, the media, they can. Non-Muslims can generalize very easily, obviously.
Right.
So, but it should do a little research, and it's country by country. And then also, I guess in France, there's more restrictions on any type of faith being represented in school, as far as what you wear. Like
it's all because of you. I think
still because of Muslims.
It's because of Muslims. If Muslims were not there, the others would have an easier time. Because it started with the hijab, with the scarf.
But different countries have different rules related to the amount of freedom people have.
Yeah, I mean, here, for example, there's...
specifically to women.
Yeah. I mean, in France, I mean, if you're talking about, I mean, it varies from country to country, whether you're talking about the rules that apply to Muslim minorities, let's say in the West, right? That varies country by country. In the Muslim world as well, it varies country by country. Yeah, it was only Saudi Arabia that had this ban on driving, right? Everywhere else, when I was in Iran, you had female taxi drivers, so, driving around perfect strangers. So it does vary a great deal. And in terms of, and yes, there are political issues that affect the degree to which the state will mandate either the public expression of religion or prohibit the public expression of religion. So you have to understand that secularism, secularism is kind of natural in many ways. It developed organically within the Western world. Of course, it's very natural to the American context. But secularism, often came with like the heavy hand of Western colonization, as Yamina was saying. And so the kind of the reappropriation after sort of periods of secularism of countries of religious dress or religious symbols or like outwardly religious practices, it's not that it isn't without spiritual and religious significance for them, but it also has a kind of political aspect to it as well. Like in the Iranian Revolution, for example, in 1979, women would wear would don the hijab as an act of protest against the Shah's regime. And now you have in Iran women taking the scarf off as an act of protest against. Both of these regimes, are fairly oppressive of their people, even though one is secular. So in other words, we would associate in the West secularism with, freedom and individuality and so on, but it wouldn't necessarily be that way in an Islamic context.
Usually in communities societies that were colonized, secularism, westernization means colonization, means bullying, means harassment, means you are forced to be what you are not. Like in Algeria, you could not learn your own language. Yeah, I mean, and you were like beaten up, women were raped, people were killed in front of their own. I'm talking about the civilian, I'm not talking about fighters. I'm talking about people the army coming to homes and terrorizing the civilian population. And I heard very little from my parents. I mean, my father has been in a, how do you call those, concentration camp for years. Things that we don't hear about. You don't know that there were concentration camps in Algeria where people were tortured.